What's going on, Wellness Gang? Welcome back to Embodied Wellness Radio, a podcast framed around making women healthy again. And today's episode is the last of our adrenal health series, where I'm going to be taking you through two more case studies looking at adrenal dysregulation. So the first case study is going to look at a picture that kind of looks like what we talked about in the adaptive phase, where total cortisol could look relatively normal. However, we do need to interpret everything in the context of the individual. The second case study is actually yours truly, ya girl, and it's going to show low cortisol and how that plays out in more of a chronic or a stage 4 stressed out state. So without further ado, let's get into it. So a little bit of context to this first client. So she is 41 years old, and in addition to what we see on the Dutch test, also had hypothyroidism. So for her specifically, the autoimmune condition Hashimoto's, resistant weight loss, and dealing with regular periods and infertility. So when we take a look at her Dutch test, again, keeping in mind her chief symptoms and that she does have confirmed hypothyroidism, we can see here that her daily cortisol pattern, if you're looking at the chart, she makes pretty much all of her cortisol in the morning and her waking cortisol is high, and then it comes down pretty much in a straight line towards the evening. So we do have a relatively normal morning cortisol. We have on the higher end of afternoon cortisol, and the nighttime cortisol is in a relatively normal range. However, the issue here is we don't have that proper cortisol awakening response, where her waking cortisol is actually higher than her morning cortisol. And then we do see this dysregulation taking place when we look at the 4 points. Now, if we look at the right side here, we can see that her 24-hour free cortisol, so when we add up the sum of all of that, is pushing towards the higher end. It's not quite there, but it is definitely pushing high, and her metabolized cortisol is very, very low. So we have almost high, or I would argue this is still high cortisol from what we would want to have as a optimal range. And her metabolized cortisol is very low, meaning that she's not able to properly clear a lot of that cortisol she has. So despite not being super high when we're looking at the actual markers, the fact that she cannot properly metabolize and clear the cortisol is an issue, causing her high cortisol symptoms to be a lot more severe. Now, if we go down to the second and third page of the Dutch test, we'll see here that this dysregulated cortisol is also playing out in some other hormones. So this client, on top of having hypothyroidism, does have a history of very chronic, intense dieting as well as overexercising. So similar to myself, we know that that impacts hormones as well. And we can see that here. So at 41 years old, before going through menopause, she does have very low levels of estrogen and very low levels of progesterone. So her progesterone levels are actually in the postmenopausal range, and her estrogen levels are pretty much pushing towards there. So this again is indicative of anovulatory cycles, meaning her cycles could be irregular or missing, as well as infertility because she doesn't have enough hormones to ovulate. And if we're not ovulating, we cannot make a baby, and also to hold a healthy pregnancy. So we're seeing this chronic stress picture and this adrenal dysregulation really play out in other hormone systems as well. So if you go back to the episode I did where I talked about how cortisol can impact other hormones, we know that it can also lead to things like low progesterone. And there's a couple ways that takes place. We have what they used to consider the pregnenolone steal being one of them, but also going back to what we talked about in the brain and the signaling of things like LH and FSH. So again, we have dysregulated cortisol here, pushing when we do the cortisol sum towards the high end of the range. We also have here low levels of progesterone and estrogen. For her specifically, DHEA and testosterone actually look in a pretty good range. So the main thing here is looking at our two main sex hormones as females, as well as the cortisol dysregulation. Now, again, when we talk about interpreting everything in the context of the individual, when we see individuals who have very high morning cortisol and it pushes towards lower at night, a lot of these clients are also going to be having experiences like waking up with a bunch of anxiety, We typically would see this in those who have child adversity or trauma. That can also manifest as high morning cortisol, and then sleep disturbances. So sleep apnea, sometimes maybe they might be having nightmares. Again, going back to things like childhood adversity. And we can really see this play out in the adrenals for those who have more of a chronic stress state. Now, for this client, that actually rings true, not the sleep apnea, but also history of things like trauma. And even again, looking back to things like low nutrient status is considered a stressor on the body, and over-exercising, and really just how this both physical and psychological trauma is now playing out in her body. So there's a lot of things to consider here. We also see this chronic stress state is really playing out in things like autoimmunity and thyroid health. So there's different causes or influences of things like Hashimoto's and low thyroid, but cortisol dysregulations, adrenal dysregulations, trauma, nutrient deficiencies, overexercise, these are all factors that can also lead to hypothyroidism. And again, that could potentially be why this client does have sluggish detox and metabolism and isn't properly metabolizing a lot of the cortisol that she's making as well. So for this specific client, if we were to only give her supplements and say, okay, we want you to try to lower your morning cortisol, so maybe she needs to take a cortisol lowering supplement in the morning, but for the rest of the day, it kind of looks okay. And in the afternoon, maybe it's a little high again. It can be a little bit tricky, right? Because it's not high across the board, and it's not even really pushing over the edge of what we would consider high on the test, but it's definitely getting there. So for something like this, again, we really want to look at the lifestyle piece. So making sure that she has nervous system support in place, making sure that she's seeing, alternative practitioners for things like counseling and being able to work through some of that stored trauma in the body. We also want to address things like nutrition. So coming from a history of chronic dieting, there's probably a lot of nutrient deficiencies that are impacting things like our ability to make progesterone and our ability to make estrogen. We also want to make sure we're not over-exercising to the point where we are essentially running our hormones into the ground and would see things like, low progesterone and low estrogen and dysregulated cortisol. So really looking at making sure that this client is well nourished was a really big piece of the healing puzzle, that we're exercising in a way that's supportive for her. So walking and strength training mixed with some yoga. And that we are, again, really focusing on that nervous system piece, especially in the evening before she goes to bed, so that she can have deeper sleeps and that she's going to be able to have more regulated cortisol in the morning. So that was part of what we did. We also did look at, again, a lot of mineral support for her, making sure that we are giving her adrenals the minerals that they need, like sodium, potassium, magnesium, even nutrients like vitamin C to help with really supporting the adrenal side of things. But really, counseling was huge in this, and working through some of that chronic longstanding history of trauma, which not only impacts from childhood, but that also can be a big reason why a lot of people do go into things like overexercising and undereating for this sense of control and feeling like we are in this like chronic fight or flight state where we have to always be doing more. So for this, it was actually a little bit deeper than just looking at like the nutrition or just looking at the supplements. And it really did have to go back to some things that have happened earlier on and the way that that's impacted her mindset and how that was actually a root of a lot of these behaviors that had led to this on the Dutch test. And now we often see this as coming through throughout someone's lifestyle. So, for me specifically, which we'll talk about next, I would always, since I was younger, been like type A overachiever. My mom will tell you a story of this one time I made a whole project and I thought it wasn't good enough. So I just redid the entire thing and started again. So I've always had this like drive to need to do more and be perfect and be better. And so when we are looking at healing, yes, we have to look at the things that are immediately within our control, like diet, lifestyle, stress, movement, all of that. But we also need to look at, again, who the person is. And if this is maybe a pattern that we're seeing come through in things like hormone status, but actually is impacting lots of different areas of their life and potentially is stemming from something that also needs to be addressed. Because even in just looking at, eating more or exercising less, we still have that underlying piece of the person or even like what's become their personality that is kind of manifesting into all these issues, which if isn't solved here, is going to then cause issues in a different place, or maybe these same issues again. So without going too much into this one, because obviously it is very personal when we're dealing with things like trauma, I would say that the main takeaway here is that sometimes it is actually a little bit deeper than just looking at the immediate things, and that those other supports like counseling and therapy can be very, very beneficial for more complex cases like this. And then understanding even how things like metabolism of stuff like cortisol and hypothyroidism can also impact sex hormone status and cortisol. So in working on, healing that trauma and working on some of the mindset stuff and the roadblocks that she came across as a result, on top of everything else that we've been doing, periods did start to become more regular. We did see some improvements to thyroid health and thyroid markers, and overall just getting better hormone status. For complex cases like this, healing is maybe not as quick as the one I mentioned in the last episode of like working on the insomnia and hot flashes, because a lot of these issues have been taking place for years and even decades in some cases. Healing can be a little bit more slow. However, when we're looking at hormones, we also need to understand like hormone cascades. So we will see things improve like energy and maybe periods, and then thyroid could still be a little bit off, but in continuing to work on these things, now we're starting to see thyroid improve. And so really being patient with your journey and understanding that not everything might change or heal altogether at once, but that it is really important to take these integrative approaches. Okay, so next we're going to look at a hormone profile that I did a few years back. I think this was maybe about 4 years ago now. And this is not a Dutch test. I did this when I was doing my schooling for becoming an FDN. So the testing that they were using is a saliva test. So this is a salivary hormone profile. And I think it is kind of neat to be able to see the differences between the two. But with the salivary hormone profile, it looks a little bit different. But it also does show things like ratios of things like cortisol to DHEA, which I have talked about. And so this is a test that actually does look at and show that. Okay, so where was I at the time that I took this test? I must have been around 23 or 24 years old. I had actually just gone through a period of pretty intense dieting, maybe 2-ish years before that, where I was eating maybe 1,300 calories a day, next to no carbs, next to no fat, pretty much like a chicken and broccoli diet with like sweet potatoes once a day. I was training a buttload. So I would wake up in the morning, usually go to the gym, do cardio. I'd go to school all day, which is stressful in and of itself. And then I would teach hot yoga and fitness classes. I think I did somewhere close to 25 or 30 a week, and it's inside of a sauna. So we're jumping around, doing HIIT workouts. And then coming off of that, when I finished school and I moved, I was still teaching a lot more. I was still going to school, and I was also moved from that to like doing more HIIT style workouts. So there was a lot of physical stress on top of chronic dieting here, on top of like the stress of being in school. And at the time, I was experiencing a lot of fatigue, menstrual cycle irregularities. When I was in the heat of my dieting, I lost my period for months. At the point I took this test, it had come back, but I was still getting it usually every like 6-ish weeks. And I had no sex drive. I had so many cravings. I had pre-diabetes, so blood sugar issues, a lot of gut-based issues. I was experiencing many food sensitivities. I was experiencing bloating all the time, gas. So really my health was just not in a great place at the time of this test. And we can kind of understand why when looking at the history. Because this looks a little bit different here, we can see that cortisol in the morning is actually in a pretty good range. And we actually will go to this chart. So you can see cortisol here in the morning. I was making good cortisol, and I always knew that I was a morning person. I had the most energy in the morning. I had the most focus. If I was going to do any focus work, it would always be in the morning as well. And generally, I just felt my best. And then by the afternoon, I would have energy crashes, but I didn't necessarily realize them all the time because I was what we call self-medicating. Meaning I would, at the time of this test, go resistance train in the afternoon, and I would have caffeine before I went. Say, take something like a pre-workout or caffeine. So I would not necessarily notice because I was, again, self-correcting by having high doses of caffeine, going to work out. And then I would always have like super intense sugar cravings come the afternoon and the evening. And if you look here at my cortisol chart, I made all of my cortisol in the morning, which was in the mid-range, and then noon, afternoon, and night, all low. So I pretty much made no other cortisol than that and was flatlined for the rest of the day. So that would explain why the day I took this test and I couldn't have caffeine was pretty much flat out on the couch in the afternoon. And I'm like, oh, that's what my body's doing without a high dose of caffeine. So the other thing about hormones that's good to test is that we do a lot of self-medicating in that we start to feel not that great. So we drink more caffeine, or we work out a little bit more, or we try to get more sleep, and we're really just trying to manage symptoms, whereas things in our body could be heading in a very not good direction as a result of that. So again, my total cortisol was not clinically low based on this test, but it was low when we're considering what the optimal range is. So it was low. My afternoon was extremely low, which is why I felt so tired. And we can see that my cortisol to DHEA ratio is also off. My estrogen was quite low, so it's at a 2.2, which for my age in the luteal phase is again like pretty close to being clinically low or non-existent. It is definitely not in the optimal range. I had low progesterone. My progesterone to estrogen ratio kind of looked okay, but just because they were both so low that there wasn't much to be off. My melatonin was actually at a decent place, and my DHEA surprisingly was still pretty high. Now, again, this goes to show that some of us have genetic predispositions to either being more robust in certain areas or genetic weak points. So for me personally, genetically speaking, I am a little bit more robust, even if you look physically. So like my dad's side of the family are pretty like strong people. My grandpa, there's a photo of him. Maybe I could pop it up on the screen. There's a photo of him where he's standing in front of a boxing bag, maybe at the age of like 60, just jacked, like huge. My dad's a very stable, sturdy guy. I have a lot of those genetics. I build muscle pretty easily. My bone structure is a little bit more like stronger. If you have ever studied or understand Ayurveda, I do have more of that kapha body type in addition to pitta. So I do have a little bit more stability in my body naturally and a little bit more vital reserve. And my Ayurveda teacher told me that my kapha 2 or like my DHEA or that predisposition saved me from being pretty much flatlined and in a lot worse of a place than I was. And she said, given everything I was doing and the way my hormone test looked, in many other women, they would be not feeling the way that I did. So I was feeling pretty crappy, but because my DHEA was still hanging in there, it almost saved me from like completely being flat out, that I was still able to make it through the day with caffeine. I was still able to, have a job that was very energetically expensive because my DHEA, which again is an anabolic hormone, was still within that good range. However, everything else definitely took a hit. So again, we need to consider things as well, like genetics. There's the quote that says genetics load the gun, but your lifestyle pulls the trigger. So my genetics saved me a little bit here, but my lifestyle was definitely like chick, chick, boom, pulling the trigger of why the rest of my hormones got so out of whack. So what did I have to do to heal? Now, at the time that I was taking this test was actually just after the original lockdown. So when the original lockdown happened, studios closed. So I was no longer able to do my job of teaching. And I remember that when I had that week of being off school, at the time I was in school for acupuncture, and I stopped teaching and I wasn't in school, I pretty much slept for like a week straight. I was so burnt out, maybe even longer. Maybe it was a couple weeks that I slept for. And so with the lockdown, we were like, studios open, studios closed. It was kind of back and forth for a little bit there. And I just decided, I'm not doing this as my career anymore. My body is shutting down. I have all these health problems at the ripe age of my early 20s, and a lot of my hormones look menopausal, and my body's shutting down, and I don't want my life to be reliant on just being able to lose my job so quickly. So this was the time that I was starting my business and shifting from having a job where I'm in a sauna for 30 hours a week, jumping around, yelling at people, exerting all this energy, to working a desk job. So I would say that that was a really big role in my healing, is that I was no longer exposing myself to that extra 20, 30 hours of working out a week, which is crazy if you think about it, and an extra 20, 30 hours of being inside of a sauna nonetheless, and the heat shock proteins. I also used to train fasted. So I do fasted cardio in the morning. I stopped that. Now I always eat before I train. I had to scale back on the high intensity workouts, which honestly took me a while. I was still like, oh, I'll just eat more and stop restricting carbs and do all these other things, take these boatload of supplements. But I was really reluctant to scale back on the intensity of my workout. So that was one of the last things. But I started to eat a little bit more before I was again eating no carbs. Now I was including things like sweet potato and fruit. So trying to eat more. I started going out more on walks. I took supplements like adrenal glandulars. I took some supplements as well for other hormones. I'm not going to say my exact protocol, but I was on quite a few supplements in the beginning, and I worked a lot on light exposure. So getting out in the morning and doing my best to really regulate my circadian rhythm to be able to produce more cortisol in the afternoon and after that first reading. So I would say that my journey did go in stages. So there were a few things that I was willing to do right away, usually what people are, which is take supplements. I was like, yeah, no problem. I could take those. But the other stuff was pretty difficult. Quitting my job wasn't as hard because I didn't really have a choice. I kind of, studios were closed. What was I going to do? So that took a big hit off. I was still teaching online classes at home, which eventually I stopped doing because they were HIIT workouts too hard on my body. And then I started to see that, all of these things that I thought were true, I need to work out more intensely. My body just can't handle hot carbs. I'm the kind of person who just needs to train more to maintain my weight. When I scaled back and I watched my body composition improve, I was like, all these stories I had held about myself and my body for so long are actually not even true. It was this idea that I had that I ran myself into the ground with, and it was quite literally destroying my health, but also not even the case. My body now, I weigh 10 pounds on average, maintaining less than when I took this test. I work out less. I don't do HIIT training anymore. Most of my cardio comes from walking, and I do martial arts, so jujitsu. I'm only in the gym strength training twice a week. I'm eating way more than I ever have. I eat a lot of carbs in a day, way more than I ever would have thought I could be able to eat. And my body looks a lot better. I feel a lot better. I have regular ovulatory cycles. I'm able to build muscle now. I have stable gut health. I don't deal with dysbiosis or food sensitivities. I have way less cravings. I barely have any cravings now. And overall, my health has just improved so much by doing less. And this is something that a lot of women really struggle with, and especially when we're looking at adrenal health, right? The state of my adrenals, which you'll see here, is chronic burnout. This is not the matter of like a few weeks or a stressful period. This was years and years of like teaching and being in school and under eating and over exercising. And it really played out in a way that pretty much, ran my health into the ground. And so to rebuild it was also a process. I say now like, I'm 10 pounds lighter, but it really was a journey that took me probably the whole 4 years to heal. I would say until this year, I feel like I'm pretty close to my optimal health. There's still a few things I can work on. And I still have more sensitive hormones, meaning if I do train too much or maybe unintentionally I'm under eating a bit because I'm, just having a busier period, my cycles can still fluctuate quite easily. And that's again, just now like a reminder to me like, okay, I do need to scale it back. So I wouldn't say I have perfect health by any means, but my health is super stable and I maintain my weight really easily 4 years later. So every year I feel like I've just improved more and more in my health. But this is again goes to show that my test didn't look like this because of a few months or a few weeks even of doing things that weren't supportive for my body, and I wasn't going to heal as quickly. And actually, when I first started healing my hormones from severely under eating, I had to go what seemed like backwards in order to get to where I am now. And there was a point where I was under eating and in the heat of that diet phase that I talked about. And to that, when I started eating again and I was dealing with a lot of overeating and kind of, I wouldn't necessarily call it binge eating, but definitely overeating and nighttime snacking, I gained almost 35-ish pounds from my lightest weight, which is a lot of weight on my frame. And I had to kind of go backwards in order to get to the place I am now. And so this is again another reminder that you didn't probably didn't get your hormones out of balance in a matter of weeks or even sometimes months. And it's going to take a while to heal, especially in some of these more chronic cases like myself. And that sometimes we have to take a step sideways, which might feel like backwards, in order to really move forward. And things aren't always going to feel better right away. They might feel worse before they feel better. But when you're committed to your long-term healing and like I knew at this stage, I can't keep doing this. If I keep doing this, I'm going to be infertile. I'm not going to be able to have kids. I'm going to be running myself into the ground. I'm going to continue to see my health deteriorate. I can't do this anymore. And so I had to make a change and be willing to commit to that journey, even when it was hard and even when I felt so uncomfortable in my body. But my commitment was there to get better and to stay better. And now my habits support me staying better. So I mentioned I was on a boatload of supplements, and now I'm able to maintain, the progress that I made with my hormones without having to take all of those, because I was willing to shift my lifestyle in order to get there. So again, this just goes to show how chronic stress can play out both with low cortisol and how that can really impact other hormones, and how change can be difficult because it does require shifting habits and stories that we believe about things. But the other side of that and the healing that comes from doing those hard changes, speaking from experience, is so worth it. I'm so grateful and so proud that I was willing to go through those really, really freaking hard times to get better and to be able to stand on the other side of it. And also, sometimes when we're in those first stages of healing, things like protocols can be more intensive, but the goal is always to come off of those. And if you feel like your hormones are a mess and your health is deteriorating like I did, another reminder that healing is possible. So this episode, I really wanted to showcase you some more chronic cases and kind of chat about how two very different cases of the first one that I talked about and my story, and how healing is definitely possible in both, but just how important, especially when we see the later stages of adrenal dysregulation, the lifestyle stuff really is, and how it can be very difficult and a longer journey to heal, but it is so worth it. So thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for tuning into our first mini podcast series on adrenal health. I'm so excited to continue to educate you and go deeper into topics. So thanks for tuning in. If you have any requests on podcasts, feel free to reach out to me on Instagram at Sarah Collins Wellness, and I hope to see you soon, Wellness Gang. Chat soon.